Like, how do you preserve your energy so that you have a long life in this work and you're able to contribute at your greatest capacity?
Mm. You know, first of all, let's just acknowledge that like your and my path are not the same because, you know, especially in a post George Floyd world where we are living these questions every minute of every day. Not that you weren't before then, but where now, you know, it's happening in the grocery store, it's happening at your kid's school, it's happening at work, everywhere it's happening. And so we have a different experience, and I don't have that exhaustion. I don't have to carry that. And you know, when I came to Cartemquin, part of it was because I hadn't realized that even though I wasn't doing direct service work, 29 years of working with people who are struggling with their trauma and living so far at the margins and supporting the staff who day in and day out were just, you know, doing that really deep humanitarian work. I mean, and I'm talking humanity work, you know, not giving out social services, but
Right.
you know, being with people at their hardest moments. It really took its toll, and you know, I'm in my 50s. I sacrificed a lot of time with my family because I was burnt out. I was exhausted. That took its toll. And, you know, when I came to Cartemquin, it was the opportunity to still do work that mattered. But I'm very honest about this because I didn't realize I needed that kind of break until it was almost too late.
Yeah.
But now I get to do work that matters, but I'm not so proximate to trauma and so proximate to the people that are so deeply in the struggle. And so I realize that in and of itself is a privilege, you know, to be able to step out of that space
Sure.
and to be able to translate life's work into another pathway that's more creative. And, you know, now I mean, I sometimes joke around. It's not funny though, but like now I get to hang out with filmmakers and they're really cool people, and we get to, you know, film and we get to edit and we get to, you know, talk about story arcs, and there's a lot of joy in that, you know. I wish I had a better answer for you
No,
because
you're fine.
it is the struggle, you know.
Yeah, but what you do lift up is that on some level we all need fulfilling work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I worked with a coach who would ask, "Are you satisfied?"
Mm.
And so now I turn that same question on project partners, even for what you imagine in leading this. Are you satisfied with the
Satisfied.
outcome? And what I found is that I want to move one step further beyond satisfaction into fulfillment.
Mm.
And because with the fulfillment comes the satisfaction.
Mm.
And so it's clear that whether we carry the weight of this burden of just navigating the struggles of, you know, an oppressive system, we still need fulfillment in some sense of the word. You know, we're
Yep.
going to pursue that, and that may be advantageous to some audiences, and that may be hazardous to others. But what we pursue, I think it matters in how that shows up in the world around us. And so, at some point, I think that there are inconveniences that we each experience in some way that may not register as a priority in on the same scale as it does for the next person. So I can't imagine what it's like to be in this space and everything is moving, everything is shifting, and then there are folks who on occasion, not always perhaps, but there are folks who may look at your skin and say, well, do you really belong here? You know, and what does that look like when you know you come bearing solutions and you're not like what that person may have
Mm-hmm.
experienced? We had on the podcast, we had a restorative justice practitioner, Dr. Shaniqua Jones, on,
Mm.
and she talked a bit about post traumatic post traumatic stress environment. and the triggers that are involved in that process. So, for example, if someone has had an adverse experience with a white person and they show up and they're triggered by that they're triggered by something, but that experience then takes them back to, clearly physically they're not in that space, but mentally they're in that space and they're reacting, adversely. Like, I can't imagine what that might be like. And so the willingness to show up with all sorts of possibilities, I do think we share in that. Because there are times I may show up in a space expecting one outcome and it be something completely different. But again, not knowing what those individuals have experienced. So I think I hear you and I agree that our plights are indeed different.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. But I think that one of the things that society has proven is that we're far more alike than we are different.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that this push against critical race theory being taught, the ban on books and other information, fake news, misinformation, is this need to suppress the truth and the reality that draws out how much more alike we are than we are different, in an effort to keep oppressive and racist systems in place. And I'm really appreciative. I know I took the long way home, but I really am really appreciative of this ability for you all to look at documentary film creation in a different way. And I'm seeing that even in like different shows and things that I binge watch or whatever, like the storyline, the framing. Even if there are shows that are talking about historic events, it's like they lean into it from a different angle, and it early on it signified to me that something in the storytelling was changing, which meant that something about the storytellers were changing, which then of course meant that the folks making the decisions, that was indeed changing. So I don't know if you have anything to add about like the decision making process, even as you're identifying what documentary films to support, and then even like how you operate the business model in making certain that as you're making these shifts, that it's still a fruitful business, but at the same time, like perhaps you're not prioritizing capital so much as you are equity.
Well, one of the things that I have a staff colleague who is always reminding me is that you can achieve equity and not have to compromise capital.
Yeah.
And it's a really reminder every day for me that, often we hear that like, oh, but if you, work with more emerging storytellers who don't have, any previous experience, we're going to sacrifice quality. And that's not been my experience, right? But I think that you brought up an important point, which was sort of like the thing you don't see when you get to see a film on screen, and that is all that goes into it. And there is the process of interrogating the story arc. One of the most powerful things that I have appreciated about Cartemquin is the way, especially our founder Gordon Quinn and others, have really helped filmmakers go through a process of understanding what their story actually is and who they're telling it for. Most people come in and like they want to get their film on a streaming platform. But when you really start going into it, this is going to be blood, sweat, and tears making this film. And so really understanding who you're making it for, why you're making it. It's really been fascinating for me to see 3 filmmakers at Cartemquin all relate that their film was going one direction until somewhere along the process, it wasn't just Cartemquin, but it was what they were going through at Cartemquin really interrogated, do they belong in the story? And that by inserting themselves in the story, everything is shifting now the story. Again, Cartemquin doesn't have a formula that we follow, but what I've experienced from the filmmakers who have come through Cartemquin is it's a combination. I sometimes like to think about it as 3 C's, right? There is a commitment to the craft, like what is actually the craft of building a story and a story arc and the quality of that story and how it comes out on. Then there's this community where we're interacting with each other and we're pushing each other, and in that community we are questioning, like, is that the way the story could go? I mentioned earlier the Documentary Accountability Working Group and their framework around ethics in storytelling. Sitting with other filmmakers and interrogating and applying those questions to the process is where the magic comes out, right? And then the last part is careers. You know, we look at how does this work? Who's getting a chance to, you know, you were saying earlier, who's getting a chance to have a credit above the line and below the line? Who's getting an opportunity that might not have previously gotten one? And when we marry those things together, the outcome almost always is magic, you know? And so I think, you know, what we're committed to is continuing to create spaces both, you know, to be in partnership with films as they're in production, but also to create spaces like the Diverse Voices in Doc, which is a project with the Community Film Workshop. You know, how do we create a cohort where the cohort is bringing their own magic? And as we choose films, you ask, like, how does it work? We're not only looking at the film and the story and all those other things I talked about. Does the person have the right to tell it? But what will the cohort bring to each other?
Yes.
And what are they contributing to each other, and what are they taking away? And so I really think the cohort model is a real strong one. Not everyone learns in that way, but for those that do, it's really, really powerful. I just want to say one thing, though, about Community Film Workshop, because this was a very sobering moment for me. When I came on board and I was meeting all of our partners, you know, I met Margaret Caples at Community Film Workshop, and she and I had a conversation as how we could support them when they were celebrating their 50th anniversary. And I went to one of her events, and she said, you know, this is the first year we've hired staff. And she and her husband built Community Film Workshop over all those decades, right, without the same resources that a Cartemplin did. Now, granted, we're not the same types of organizations. We are different in our mission and orientation. We're aligned, and Community Film Workshop is not a production company per se. It's a different kind of organization. But there's a huge inequity that is so palpable right there. And so, you know, that has really led me to think about, like, you know, how do we show up for Community Film Workshop, and how are we supporting, you know, not just supporting them in you know, sharing out their events and things like that, but every chance I get when I'm talking to a funder, I raise that question and I talk about those things, because those are the systemic and structural things that will ultimately change, you know. As important as individual films are, and they are important. You said something, though, earlier that really struck me, and that was, you know, the suppression of truth. I don't have any corner on the truth, but my experience is that fear is almost always at the base of it. And I don't know how many years I have left on the planet, but the one thing I have come to know is that the only antidote to fear is a sense of love and understanding, right? And it's really hard to love and understand something you don't ever see, you don't have proximity to. So again, you know, I believe in the power of films to bring things to the screen that will help you feel like it's a familiar instead of something to be afraid of. And you know, I think about the backlash against trans lives right now. What will it mean, I hope, in the next decade, when more and more stories are just something that people are familiar with, and people can understand the quality and beauty of lives regardless of their sexual identity or their gender identity or how they identify themselves. I think that's the power of narrative change, right? Because without it, we can change the law, but unless people are able to replace fear with a sense of, at least, if not love, at least less fearfulness of others, you know. I don't believe in tolerance. I think that's not what I'm after. I'm talking about how do we at least see each other's humanity. And when you know someone's story, it's hard to fear them.
It is.
And like you said, you start to see, that, you start to see the things we have in common. And, I am also like really grateful for people like Olivia Chase and Michelle Day, who led the restorative justice work that I got to participate in. Women who basically called the ancestors and brought us all together and, showed us spaces where we could be in relationship with one another despite how different our paths were.
No, this is powerful. I totally see why you, in your role at Potemkin, and however non-traditional your journey has been, the timing is right. Your heart is in the right place for this, and that matters in how we do this work. And I think we're in a place now where it matters more about the ways in which folks approach their work in leadership than it does their own functionality and being able to execute. That it's clear, like, what informs your decision making, or even if not what, it's clear that there's a process or some sort of methodology involved that helps to inform your decision making. And we certainly need more of that, in order to see the changes that, we've seen protesters advocate for, and community rights activists advocate for. I don't want folks to minimize the power of media.
Yes.
We live by it now. With
right.
social media platforms and YouTube channels and all those things that allows us to capture, that makes us storytellers, that makes us to some extent media makers, wherever we may be on that spectrum of respectability. Maybe it's a hobby, maybe it is just because it's a trend, or maybe it's a career. But I think what I've heard you say here is that you all have identified where those intersections meet and how you can provide. I think my greatest takeaway from this conversation is the accountability needed in documentary making, and being able to ensure that exists for not just the filmmakers, but for the decision makers. And in that accountability, there's that throughout, so that we don't, we've already started in this direction. There's
That's
no
right.
turning back. No, if we need to pivot and the story shifts, then we give the moment what it needs. And that type of fluidity, I don't know that we see that enough in business to start.
Yes.
But to be able to trust that if we're to, as a legacy organization, if we're to survive, we have to be that flexible.
And I think this is, to me, the power of small, independent, nonprofit media. Whether, I was thinking about the Becoming of Us gathering that, and thinking about the power of smaller, more community-based journalism, and media makers like you and like Potemkin and like the Community Film Workshop and all the people who make media through us, is that we are the avant-garde, right? We move nimbly. We aren't afraid. We interrogate what we say we're about. We will can a story before we put something out. We will stop a film before we just go full speed ahead. Like, I think it's, I have spent the better part of my career trying to help people understand that the nonprofit space isn't the lesser space, right? I think, what I wish is that it was flipped on its head, and that, like, for-profit companies had people like you and I sitting on their boards and helping them run themselves, right? Versus the other way around. Not that I have,
No, but I hear
disagreement about having people on the board. I'm simply saying that, like, I think that we do something really powerful that people can pay attention to, and we are already an example for others.
Totally.
And it's the combination of vulnerability, non-performative action, interrogation, risk-taking, and the great liberation that comes from that. Like, I really, if I can say nothing else, I don't want to always focus on how hard it is. It is very hard. But it takes so little for there to be complete, freedom that comes in these small and large actions.
Totally. Totally.
So
I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I know we will continue to
I hope
discuss
so.
and learn how we can our organizations can continue to support each other. How can folks can connect with Cartemquin?
Yeah, please. Well, we would love you to go to our website, cartemquin.com, visit us. All of our films are listed there. In April, dun dun dun, we'll have a new website, and not only will you be able to, click directly into how to see the films, but you'll be able to really look at all the films through different issue lenses. You'll be able to screen through that way. We also are really encouraging people to follow along with the AAPI Film Fund fundees, our Diverse Voices in Docs program. These filmmakers are amazing, and the stories that are coming out are not only need to be told, but they're riveting and they're compelling. So we hope to have in the spring as well some collaborations with places like the Chicago History Museum and others. So we've been quiet for a while we went through the reflection period, and the staff when I came on board said, please let's show before we tell. And so we've been working on showing, but we're coming out of the pandemic. Films are being filmed again. We are back, in production. It feels really, really good. And I hope that we get to continue to collaborate together. I hope you will continue to challenge me, and I hope people will follow along and push Cartemquin. I mean, these are only the first steps, and next year is the 30th anniversary of Hoop Dreams. We're also coming on the 50th anniversary, or the anniversary of 63 Boycott. Okay. So anyway. Lots of great stuff coming on.
Yes. Well, congratulations on the anniversary of Hoop Dreams. Thank you so much for joining us for the Public Narrative Podcast. I'm Jhmira Alexander, and we'll see you again soon.